Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. A few days ago, we came to Concord, North Carolina to look at historical markers and old buildings all around town. And while we were here, we checked out the fountain that was dedicated to the Cabarrus County Black Boys. At the time we were here, I had actually never heard of the Cabarrus County Black Boys. I didn't know anything about them. And I filmed the fountain while we were here. But as I went home and started to learn more about them, I got really interested in the story. I think it's a really cool one. So I've come back to show you the fountain again, get a little bit more footage of it, and tell you the whole story that I have learned online. I think it's a really neat one, and I hope you enjoy it. Let's go check out this fountain. Something that I did not realize about our American history is that there was an uprising in the state of North Carolina in the years leading up to the start of the Revolutionary War, known as the Regulator Movement, which occurred between the years 1766 and 1771. The regulators at the time did not necessarily wish to change the form of their government, but simply wanted to abolish corrupt government and make the colony's political practices just, fair, and equal. They wanted better economic conditions for everyone, instead of a system that heavily benefited the colonial officials and their network of plantation-owning overlords. They were beginning to rebel against corrupt government and protesting issues like excessive taxation, dishonest sheriffs, and illegal fees. The main difference between the regulators and the traditional patriots, as we think of associated with the Revolutionary War, is that while the regulators were in support of a change of policies, they did not necessarily approve of hasty conduct and the occasional violent proceedings that were starting to occur as the traditional patriotic sentiments were just beginning to take roots. Difficulties were arising in the early 1770s between the tyrannical British governor William Tryon and the North Carolina regulators, and Governor Tryon was determined to coerce the regulators into submission. He sent to Charleston, South Carolina, for 3 wagons loaded down with all the munitions that he needed to make war, including gunpowder, flints, blankets, and other supplies to be delivered to the town of Hillsborough, North Carolina. These articles were shipped for him from one place to the next, and made it as far as into the city of Charlotte before the common people began to be suspicious as to the planned destination and intention of these supplies. Locals began to refuse to cooperate with assisting the transportation of the supplies, and the wagons became stuck in Charlotte with no one willing to transport them any further. Eventually, a colonel named Moses Alexander, who was a magistrate under the colonial government, succeeded in obtaining wagons of his own to continue the transportation of the munitions for the rest of the journey to Hillsborough in obedience to the tyrannical governor's wishes. That's where the Cabarrus County Black Boys story begins. The Black Boys were a total of 9 young men, perhaps teenagers, all born and raised along the Rocky River in Cabarrus County, just outside of Charlotte, North Carolina. The boys involved included 3 brothers named James, William, and John White, along with their cousin William White. They were also joined by several of their friends, including a brave young man named William Alexander, who later went on to become known as the brave Captain Black Bill Alexander. Other friends included James Ashmore, Robert Caruthers, Benjamin Cochran, Robert Davis, and Joshua Hadley. These boys met in secret and bound themselves together by a most solemn oath not to ever divulge that the early seeds of the spirit of patriotism had overtaken them, and they were determined to do something to prevent that wagon supply full of ammunition from leaving the city of Charlotte. The perfect opportunity presented itself one evening in 1771 when the father of the White brothers left home with his 2 horses in order to obtain bags of grain. In order to prevent detection or identification, the boys blackened their faces, possibly with mud or gunpowder, and set out on their intended mission on foot as rapidly as they could run in pursuit of Colonel Moses Alexander and his convoy of wagons. Fortunately for the boys, they ran into Mr. White as he was returning home with his horses laden down with bags of grain. Because the boys had disguised their faces, Mr. White did not recognize who they were, even his own sons. The boys demanded the use of his horses. Mr. White pleaded heartily to keep the horses, or at least to be allowed to use them to carry home his heavy bags of grain. His petitions were in vain, however. The boys ordered him to dismount, removed the bags of grain from the horses, and left them with the old man by the side of the road. They then mounted the horses and galloped just as fast as they could in pursuit of the supply wagons. They came upon the wagons encamped at Pfeiffer's Hill, 3 miles west of the present town of Concord. Under cover of darkness, the boys cautiously, surreptitiously unloaded the wagons, broke open the heads of the kegs, poured the gunpowder into a pile, and made a trail of powder for a considerable distance away from the pile. Then James White fired a pistol into the trail, which produced a tremendous explosion. 2 of the powder wagons were destroyed, as well as all of the blankets, clothing, kettles, food, and supplies. A piece of shrapnel struck White on the forehead and severely wounded him. However, all of the boys were able to slip away and disappear into the night undetected. As soon as this bold exploit became known to Colonel Moses Alexander, he focused his attention on trying to figure out who the perpetrators were of what he referred to as such a foul deed committed against His Majesty the King. The situation actually remained a mystery for quite some time, and great threats were made by tyrannical colonial government against the criminals. Governor Tryon was enraged that he did not know exactly who had perpetrated this crime against the crown, and was frothing at the mouth to get them into his grasp for punishment. Eventually, in order to try to entice someone with knowledge to turn in the perpetrators, Governor Tryon decided to offer a pardon to anyone who would turn in King's evidence against the rest of the group. 2 of the boys, half-brothers James Ashmore and Joshua Hadley, decided unbeknownst to each other to avail themselves of that pardon, and they accidentally met on the front threshold of Moses Alexander's house when they showed up to confess. After they relayed the story of the 9 boys involved and their plot, Moses Alexander remarked that, by the virtue of the governor's proclamation, they were to be pardoned, but they were the first ones that ought to have been hanged. Hadley and Ashmore were allowed to leave unscathed, but their confession forced the rest of their friends to flee for refuge in the state of Georgia. Governor Tryon continued to hold out insinuations that if the boys would return home and turn themselves in with a confession, they would be pardoned. Eventually, the boys tired of being on the run in Georgia and did return to their homes in Concord. But as soon as Moses Alexander found out that they had returned, he surrounded the White family home with a guard posted at every door. However, one of the guards apparently favored the boys and helped them escape by striking up a quarrel with Alexander just long enough to permit them to slip out of a back door. In just a few jumps, the boys were in the river and swimming safely to a nearby mansion. An alarm was raised, but pursuit of the boys was fruitless. Rumors began to circulate in the days that followed that the boys were hiding out in a harvest field, and several times the Royalists set out on horseback to try to capture them. However, there was always someone in the Royalists' company who sympathized with the boys on the run. Secret hand signals were created to communicate with the boys so that they would know who the sympathetic Royalist was and how to flee to safety. Additionally, the Whig Party was developing a strong sympathy for the boys, and they often gathered in bodies of 25 to 30 men to stealthily pursue the Royalists, ready to pounce on them the moment they captured any of the boys. The Royalists continued to range the countryside, unsuccessful in their pursuit of the Black boys. And thus the Black boys continued to flee from covert hiding spot to covert hiding spot to save their necks from the bloodthirsty Royalists. Sometimes they would hide concealed for weeks while neighbors carried food and water to them. One time, Robert Davis was pursued so closely he was forced to jump his horse 30 feet down a bank into the river. He stopped on the other side long enough to taunt the Royalist who was pursuing him and dare him to try to follow. At one point, the weary boys decided to go to Hillsborough and beg the pardon of Governor Tryon, who continued to offer the allurement of pardon if they would turn themselves in. They nearly made it to Hillsborough before finding out that it was Governor Tryon's intention to have them hanged together, each and every single one of them if he could get his hands on them. They returned to the Rocky River area and continued to keep themselves concealed. Eventually, their pursuers became weary of the chase and ceased pursuit. The oath by which the boys had bound themselves together was of the strongest kind and sustained them through their years of hiding until the patriotic sentiment, which had only been in its infancy in 1771, grew to fruition with the signing of the Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence in May of 1775. Concealment was no longer necessary, and when the Revolutionary War finally broke out, those same Cabarrus County black boys stood up for the cause of American freedom and fought on many battlefields for the independence of our country. I think that was a really special story. I think it was worth telling on our channel. I had never heard of the Cabarrus County Black Boys before, and this is what I love about going out to search for monuments, statues, markers. We've all heard of things like the Revolutionary War, but these little individual special moments in time, special people, special things that happened, like I would have never known about this if there hadn't been a fountain erected in their honor. And I think it's so cool that seeing the fountain a week or two ago when we were here kind of triggered my interest, and here I am back and I know a lot more about it today, and I'm so excited that I got to share it with you guys. I hope you enjoyed this video. I will see you another day in another adventure. Bye, everybody.